Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And it is, in fact, a late hour, but it's a good metaphor for where we are on the climate crisis, because at the moment we're standing on the very edge of too late in terms of the advice that we've been given by the international scientific process, the largest peer review process in the history of human civilization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I want to start by acknowledging that we're standing here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Nation and say meegwetch. I also want to begin by saying how deeply moved, concerned, committed, I think all of us are in this place, to assist the people of Atlantic Canada et aussi au Québec, parce que Îles, la Madeleine est aussi affectées.
Were also affected by the hurricane. And I also have concerns for the people of Saint-Pierre-and-Miquelon.
The French protectorates south of Newfoundland and Labrador, search the news to see. That's a place I've visited and find intriguing and charming. Saint-Pierre-and-Miquelon, pretty darn exposed to Fiona as she ran through eastern Canada, Quebec, and every single one of our Atlantic provinces. As you've heard me mention a few times in this place, I'm both a Cape Bretoner and a British Columbian. And I have family in both places and have experienced the climate events that walloped British Columbia last summer and summer of 2017 and many other occasions, and experienced previous hurricanes through Atlantic Canada. My thoughts are with everyone who's been impacted. And I also want to express, if the Minister of Emergency Preparedness happens to be watching, to send him our good thoughts. I know he's recovering from knee surgery, as I did recently, and it's no picnic. And I'm sure he's working really hard from wherever he is in dealing with emergency preparedness now. Tonight's debate raised a lot of commonalities, and I want to speak to those because I think it's important when we find things in common. And one of them was that, so often we heard people speaking of the impacts from Hurricane Fiona. No phones, no cell phones, no electricity, a real sense of isolation. But I can say those very same things run through a lot of climate events that have happened in the last few years. In my own riding of Saanich Gulf Islands, we had the entire bracketed the week of Christmas 2018 for many people within the riding. No phones, landlines, no cell phones, no electricity, particularly in the Gulf Islands, an experience very much like the one we've heard of, people running out with their chainsaws, clearing trees out of the way, trying to help neighbors, reaching the elderly neighbors who were alone at Christmas, getting help to people because no other help was coming. The same thing was true, talked to the fire chief in Ashcroft about the summer of 2017 when they were on evacuation warnings. This is interior BC, not far from Lytton in the riding of Mission Matsui Fraser Canyon. The fire chief said, well, we didn't know what to do. We had no phones, no cell phones. We had no power, and we were told we were on evacuation alert. We didn't know how we were going to let our citizens know if we had to evacuate. We think now the technology we need is a really big bell at the fire station so we can warn the town. I mean, our technology is running up against some fairly grim limits that are set by extreme weather events that knock out all our technology. We need to really pay attention to this. The same thing was said of what happened in the floods that occurred in November. Everybody was there with no phones, no cell, no electricity. So we have some commonalities, and I'd like to also focus when we say Atlantic Canadians are resilient, neighbor helps neighbor. I'd like to say Canadians are resilient. Neighbor helps neighbor. Whether you're on the Gulf Islands of my riding or interior BC, or you're a farmer in the prairies and you need help, or you're an Atlantic Canadian, and I don't even think there's a rural-urban divide. To the extent that it's possible to help in an urban center, and I will say I think rural Canadians have more skills to handle the collapse of things all around them. But I think the heart and soul of every Canadian is to help everybody who is a neighbor to get out there and pitch in when a community is in trouble. I do think that Atlantic Canada, provincial governments, every single one of them, and the federal government, did a remarkable job in warning people. The number of lives lost is tragic in this storm, but we lost 800, 900 people in BC last summer between the heat dome, which was completely predictable right down to the hour, and the provincial government ignored it, never called for an emergency, never warned communities. So there's a difference when governments respond appropriately, and I want to give credit where credit's due here. The government of Nova Scotia, PEI, New Brunswick, and Newfoundland and Labrador, and the federal government identified early that this was going to be really bad and did their best to tell people to stay home and not take chances, and that saved lives. And forgive me for being angry about it, but the provincial government of British Columbia cost lives last year when it decided not to call for a state of emergency and not to warn communities and not to open cooling centers. I hope we've learned, if we compare the two kinds of disasters, provincial governments play a big role here. They have to step up early and say it's an emergency, we need help, and when they do that, the federal partner has to reach out as well. So there's two parts of this debate we've had tonight. What we do immediately to help people rebuild, and that has been raised. Quite a few members have noted that we can't necessarily rebuild exactly where we were. We have to have a resilience, we have to adapt to a changed circumstance of extreme weather events that have not yet finished doing their worst. They will continue to worsen. That is baked into the climate science. But we do know that as we rebuild and help people, that help must be real and tangible and not just be empty words. I have mentioned more than a few times tonight that the people of Lytton are still waiting to see a town. People are still waiting to be rebuilt where they are. My husband's farm, it's a family place, but his daughter had been living there and nearly died in the heat dome. So literally, the temperature at my husband's farm last summer hit 50 degrees Celsius, and my stepdaughter Julia nearly died. So they're not there anymore, but the house has been pretty steadily occupied by people who have no place to go. So last summer there was a wave of first the people who'd lost their homes in the fires, and then people who'd lost their homes in the floods. So the house has proved very helpful for lots of people who have no place to live. This is the reality of the climate emergency on the bleeding edge of it, which is in places like Lytton and Ashcroft and now Atlantic Canada. The second part of how we respond is, what do we learn about climate science? How was this hurricane affected by climate events such as a warming ocean? We know that the heating of our atmosphere dumps itself into our oceans in ocean heating. Every single second, I find this astonishing, every second of every minute of every hour of every day, the oceans absorb, due to the climate crisis, the energy equivalent of 7 Hiroshima bombs every second. No wonder the ocean south of Nova Scotia has been heating. It's been heating for some time, and then the hurricanes that come up the eastern seaboard, when they track along the Gulf Stream and the water doesn't cool down the way it used to, the average temperature for the water south of Nova Scotia, pre-climate change, used to be about 15 degrees Celsius in September this time of year. If you look at the temperature records for last week, it was 20 degrees and then 18 and had dropped to 17 degrees the day that Fiona hit Nova Scotia and Cape Breton and all the adjacent areas. But it was accompanied by, as several members have said, extraordinarily low barometric pressure. In fact, the lowest barometric pressure ever recorded from any storm in Canada. And we had a wind shear event, which, as the honourable member from Charlottetown mentioned, was the big surprise for PEI. The windstorm wasn't really like any hurricane they'd ever seen before. So we need to pay attention to the climate advice. And that means the Government of Canada, as hard as it is for the Liberals to do this, must recognize that the IPCC has warned us that if we do not stop adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, if we do not ensure that they peak and begin to drop before 2025, it will be too late to hold to 1.5 degrees or even 2 degrees. That's why it really matters that we get this right, because the window will close on 1.5 or 2 degrees before the next election. That means the government itself has to turn itself inside out. The Liberal caucus has to be the place of the crucible of decision-making of whether we want our children to survive in a livable world with a functioning civilization. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Peace River Westlock.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank my honourable colleague from Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech again tonight and her stories around the heat dome in BC. I'm just wondering, my honourable colleague from the NDP is probably going to bring this up as well. Just around the case for mitigation, I just was wondering on her thoughts. How do we go forward on mitigating some of these climate change effects that we're experiencing in Canada? Thanks.
For Saanich Gulf Islands.
My honourable colleague from Peace River Westlock, we did submit as the Green Party a very long piece of advice to the consultation the government's running on how do we adapt, what changes can we make, and we went through what do we do for farmers, what do we do for the forest industry, what do we do. We have to put saving lives up front. We have to make sure that if there's a heat dome coming, we actually get people to safety. One of the more chilling things I heard in preparing that report on adaptation, which can be found on my nonpartisan website, elizabethmaymp.ca, was from Professor Blair Feltmate at the University of Waterloo, who said, yeah, 700 British Columbians died in the heat dome. If we had had a power failure at the same time, which is not far-fetched, thousands would have died. So we have to think about each one of these major kinds of events, whether it's a hurricane, a flood, a fire, wind events, and figure out how do we keep people safe. And there are many ways, and they come from the practicality of members like the member for Peace River Westlock.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member from Saanich Gulf Islands for her speech, as usual. And she's pointed out here many times the dangers that we face. Even if we stopped all carbon emissions in the world right now, we would still be in this situation for centuries where we would be having these incredible hurricanes, we would be having catastrophic forest fires, floods. That wouldn't stop. What we're trying to stop is making things worse. You know, this is only going to get worse. And so there is this case for adaptation. We have to deal with the situation as it is now. And I just wanted to touch on the heat dome, whether it occurs in BC or Alberta or wherever next time, about the idea of, and this brings me back to PEI as well. PEI has a program around heat pumps, and would a really serious investment by this federal government in a heat pump program that would allow people to have cooling, in especially low-income Canadians, and especially in British Columbia, where not many people have air conditioning. That's what killed people. They were stuck in their homes. They basically just got too hot. And I'm just wondering if we can save a lot of people if we provide low-income Canadians with heat pumps that would get us off natural gas, other forms of heating, and at the same time provide the cooling necessary to perhaps save them in a heat dome event.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
I completely agree with my friend from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, but I would add as well, we need to make sure that we have distributed energy systems such as solar panels to run a generator to make sure that people who are relying on a heat pump don't have it conk out because their power grid has gone down at the same time. When we're looking at Fiona, and right now people are running generators to keep themselves going. We went through this, obviously, Mr. Speaker. The ice storm event was another climate event that affected an urban area. Those people who had generators were able to help the neighbors that didn't have generators. But we do need, there's a lot the government can do, but I think the number one thing also is to make sure our electricity grid works east, west, and north, south, and continually recharges itself with renewable energy so that the grid itself is the big battery we need.
And we have time for one more quick question. The honourable member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the member for Saanich Gulf Islands talked about the promise of help versus the delivery of help. And we've seen that that's a concern, I think, in the debate here. We've experienced it after Dorian in 2019, where the help that was promised didn't arrive for a lot of our municipalities. We've heard about the floods last year in BC. I wonder if you could expand a little more on that issue and where you've seen that happen, where the issue seems to fade and the money doesn't flow.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank my friend from South Shore St. Margaret's. And apropos of the last debate we were having about the fixed link, I was actually the Minister of Environment's office when we signed off on that being the first piece of infrastructure that adapted to climate change, because it was built for a 1 meter sea level rise. But yeah, there is a lot. I think we need to stop taking our attention off an issue once it's no longer in the front pages. And we need to find a place where we get the money. I respectfully suggest that the profiteering by big oil right now from the profits they get from the war in Ukraine, we should double their tax for 1 year from 15% to 30%. That would generate $8 billion we could dedicate to making sure we protect communities and help them rebuild.